So I'm very excited to welcome Budrino here today. Budrino, also known as the Ottawa Oracle, also a founding political analyst of Justice Greens, political analyst to Justice International. He does so much work, so much amazing work. And what I'm always impressed by is whenever he makes a forecast, not only is he typically correct, but he has like a water flow to everything that he's forecasting. And if A doesn't happen, B is going to happen. If B doesn't happen, C is going to happen. And very, very seldom have I seen it get to like the C scenario. So I'm very excited to be here. I feel like it's maybe witchcraft. Maybe we'll ask him about that in a future episode. But Budrino, thank you so much for making the time to be here.
Thanks for having me.
So I think like the big thing is like with this program, we always try to talk about how to make things actionable and kind of what's like the trending topics. And right now, it looks like there's an election just barreling towards us so quickly. And I think one thing that you've mentioned is that it looks as though it's coming so quickly because Trudeau is trying to beat the COVID crush. People are realizing that we've been put in a really precarious situation. The masses are at risk. Trudeau doesn't care about us. And it looks like he's trying to beat that. I don't know if you'd be willing to kind of start the conversation off of why you think there's such a rush to get to the election and what we should be thinking about as general people.
I think Trudeau has a big rush to get it done as quickly as possible because we know that there's going to be a fourth wave with students across Canada under 12. They won't be vaccinated in time for the school year. So logically, it makes the most sense for the Liberals to get this election done and have election day before the fallout from that happens. So I think when we look at the precedents of what's happened over the last year too, at the start, Trudeau was a little bit more willing to work with the NDP and other political parties, but throughout his minority government, he's gotten less and less willing. He tried to call purposely a confidence vote to trigger an election that didn't work. And he's out of options at this point because quickly, I'll just say there's usually four ways you have an election, right? Either the party in power or the parties pass an election bill, or you have a minority government that loses a confidence vote. Trudeau already tried that, it didn't work. Or you have the 4-year cycle that came from Harper, the scheduled 4-year election. So if you don't do anything, eventually just every 4 years an election happens. That's not going to happen until 2023. And I don't see Trudeau waiting that long because I don't think he's going to be doing good enough in the polls. So his only option is to ask the Governor General for a dissolution of Parliament and for an election. And I think all signs lead to that. The fact that we didn't have a Governor General for months, and then he installed Mary Simon in the summertime when Parliament's not in session right now and hasn't been for a while. And I think everything, all the clues, Trudeau recently talking about abortion in New Brunswick, basically going on a campaign across Canada. I think everything leads to the fact that he's going to call an election. I'm hearing they're going to drop the writ on like around August 8th, possibly a bit later. And then you have a window of like 37 to 50 something days to call an election after that. And he's going to do the minimum you can, 37 days probably, to get that done as quickly as possible. Right now, it looks like it'll be the second week of September. And by that point, second week's school will be in session, but I don't think the fourth wave is going to be, it's just going to be starting 2 weeks in, especially with how long COVID takes to show symptoms and stuff like that. I think he's trying to slip it in beforehand because if he waits until October, there definitely will be a rise in cases and a rise in the reproduction value of COVID.
Okay, so just so I'm clear, you're not cynically saying that Justin Trudeau is risking all of our lives just so he can have majority government, are you?
The other thing too, I think that's really important is that I think he cares less about the Western provinces because right now Saskatchewan and Alberta don't have mask mandates. I don't think BC does either, right?
No.
So those provinces, it's even more risky. At least Ontario, we still have a mask mandate. But some of the other provinces like Alberta, there's pretty much no COVID measures at all right now. So I think he's especially calling it because he doesn't care what happens in Alberta. I think he cares the most what happens in Quebec and Ontario. That's what's going to determine his majority or minority. And I think he especially doesn't care about people in places like Saskatchewan or Alberta, where it's going to be mostly conservative seats anyways. So he doesn't care about those people having to go into schools if there's no mask mandates and go in and vote with a bunch of COVID cases.
Is there any storyline that you're particularly watching right now in regard to like all this ramp up? Like for me personally, I'm seeing the numbers skyrocket, and I'm seeing like the news about this coming up skyrocket. And for me, I'm like getting more into like this whole like classicide notion where it's just the wealthy are happy to throw us around and let us die. But maybe I'm getting too into the weeds. Like, are you seeing any storylines that maybe are A, just interesting, or B, would play a role in if he might even get that majority, even if he calls us early?
I think, like, when I went to university for political science, the professors always said Canada's natural governing party is the Liberals. And I think because of COVID, I think Trudeau can get away with calling an election in COVID because most people don't understand why we're having an election. And most people don't really understand what a minority government is. They don't really understand that kind of stuff. So I think he's going to be able to get away with it. The conservatives are going to frame it as, oh, it's a Trudeau dictatorship power grab or whatever.
Yeah.
So I think the conservatives people will, be really hateful towards that. But I think Trudeau will be able to get away with it just by framing it as, oh, kind of the same thing Horgan did. We need, new investments. We need to better society, whatever. I think that he's going to be able to get away with it because it's just the people are very forgiving towards the Liberals. I think, especially in Canada, especially at the federal level, people have always been traditionally very forgiving to the Liberals. And I think in terms of whether it's a majority or a minority, I think it's literally like right now the 338 projection is like 169 seats, and he needs like 170 or 171 more. To be comfortably, he would need a few more seats because he's probably going to lose a couple MPs throughout his government. So he probably wants to be at least above like 175. And I think it's, in terms of like narratives, I think that's something he could probably get. He can probably get away with getting that, especially depending on how he frames things like that. Like the thing with the Liberals, I always say is that, if they're ever talking about policy or they're ever talking about something, it's an election time. Whenever there's no election, they don't talk about anything. The MPs, Trudeau, he just does his stupid social media, does his stupid events. But once election time comes around, all of a sudden he's talking about abortion in New Brunswick, which that was never really a topic he cared about before. All of a sudden he's talking about a SkyTrain in BC or whatever's going on with that. All of a sudden he's talking about $10 a day daycare, which was promised, I think, under Chrétien when I was like a baby. Like, it's all of a sudden they start talking about this kind of stuff. So I think Canada will be pretty forgiving to him for calling this COVID election, because I just think a lot of people don't necessarily understand. And I think especially in terms of like majority or minority, he's just trying to slip this in as quickly as he can without any big scandals, because scandals have really hurt Trudeau, in my opinion. Compared to 2015, he's lost a lot of support with youth. He's lost a lot of support in general. In 2015, I think he won like almost 40% of the vote. He's not going to get that this election, probably. Best case, maybe he gets like 37 or 38 or something, best case scenario. So I think especially he's just trying to avoid as many scandals as he can and just slip this in as quickly as he can without anything, any negative stories, no We Charity, no blackface scandal. He wants to slip this in as quickly as possible under the radar and just hope that there's just enough turnout so that he can get that 175 seats that he wants.
I understand you're a professional. I am not. How can we blow up Justin Trudeau? Like, I look at the Conservatives and I kind of like the Alec Jones stuff. Like, I understand it's bad, but in terms of reaching their demographic, I'm like, yo, that's actually kind of beautiful. That's exactly what these people want to see. Do you feel like there's an appeal to be made to the left or to like the popular public that doesn't pay attention? Or even like secondary to that, is it worth it to just try to blow up Trudeau and talk about how he's promised all these things and lied about these things and just get that thank you for your donation video going, trying to get it going viral? Is it just to distill that, is it better than to try to produce a specific content to appeal to a demographic? Or do you think there's room with all of he's lied about so far to really use that as a narrative against him?
I think there's a lot of room to use how many things he's screwed up against him. Like when Trudeau originally came into power, I was really upset, not because he won one term, but I thought he would easily win two majorities. But he's had so many scandals, whether it's We Charity, blackface, just he's had the what was it, the Aga Khan scandal. He's had so many ethics scandals, SNC Lavalin, the things that happened, the fallout from that with Jody Wilson-Raybould, like Jane Philpott, his finance minister resigning. Like he's had quite a few scandals, and in Canada that's usually.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Is he just good? Like, how does he survive these scandals?
I honestly, like, if my real political opinion is, I really think the way he looks and the way he acts saves him. I think a lot of people are sexually attracted to him, to be honest, and they're more forgiving. Like, this is something in political science that a lot of people haven't necessarily investigated. But since I also have, like, I have a background in sociology as well, and some other courses and stuff like that I took in university, and I definitely noticed with Trudeau that his appearance, the fact that he's attractive, the fact, the way he dresses nice, his demeanor. I think when we look back to Mulroney, Chrétien, Pierre Trudeau Sr., like they all had a scandal that ended them. And Trudeau's had a lot of scandals that could have ended him, especially like the blackface scandal. If that was Harper, that would have been it for Harper for sure. But I think a lot of the passionate liberals, the people who really like him, they have emotional connections to him. They're not willing to let go unless he does more and more and more. So I think those passionate liberals are going to keep voting for him. But I think a lot of the average people, especially young people, because when in the first term when Trudeau won, pretty much everyone I knew when I was in high school at that point. I think I was just out of high school. Pretty much almost every single person I knew voted for Trudeau at that point. And since then, a lot of those people I know have switched to NDP. Some of them switched to Conservative. There's very few people I know, young people, and that's just not anecdotal evidence. That's actually, when we look at the polling of young people, Jagmeet Singh is polling the same way with young people now that Justin Trudeau was in 2015. So I think Trudeau's lost a lot of support among young people, but he's also made some gains with older people, especially with the older boomer crowd, which, you know, for some reason are kind of losing faith in the Conservatives, which is surprising. But I really think the strategy to use to hit Trudeau on all the things he's done wrong, because there's really a lot to attack him on. And I think for average people, there's not much good things that Trudeau did in his like power. Like the only good things he did, and it's kind of debatable if it's good, was legalize weed, and he increased like the baby bonus amount. And besides that, he really hasn't achieved anything. He signed recently a couple deals with the childcare, but that's still a pretty neoliberal solution. It's not like that's happening right away. I think it's going to take 5-10 years, whatever, to get it fully implemented and stuff like that. So I think the way to go for sure is to attack Trudeau at this point. I think too, like with the other parties and just people in general making appeals, the Conservatives are falling apart so much, you don't need to attack them at all. They're just in disarray, probably the biggest disarray since this new Conservative Party was founded. So I think all the focus should be on attacking the Liberals, attacking them for their record, attacking them for wanting to have a lower amount for CERB, because so many Canadians, millions of Canadians collected CERB. And although the Liberals try to make it like they originally intended for it to be 2,000, they didn't. That's fake news. So I think, you know, something like that, like attacking the Liberals for their record on wanting lower amounts for CERB, a lot of people took that money. And I feel like that's a way for people to, I think some people might feel in a sense guilty if they took that money and then they actually find out afterwards, oh, I would have only gotten 1,200 or whatever it was supposed to be. That extra 800 came from the NDP. You know, that helped me with my food expenses, my living expenses. Maybe I should reconsider who I'm voting for.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I wonder, what do you think is like the cause of the NDP doing so well in the polls? Is it as simple as Jagmeet's hot, or is it because like the Conservatives are falling apart, so people feel more comfortable saying this time I will vote NDP? Do you think it's more of a singular thing, or it's just kind of an amalgamation of everything?
I think it's an amalgamation of a lot of different things. I think definitely a lot of Jagmeet Singh's surge comes from being popular with young people. I also think that the Conservatives falling apart There's people who are passionate conservatives, social conservatives, but there's also a few ridings that I don't think a lot of people realize, like average viewers and of politics and stuff like that, that there's a few ridings in Ontario where it's between the NDP and the Conservatives on who's going to win. And we typically seem to think, oh, it's always between strategic voters for the Liberals and the NDP. But the truth is there's strategic voters of all kinds. There's people who like the PPC and they're going to strategically vote for the Conservatives. There's people who are communists who are going to strategically vote for the NDP. So I feel like that's another factor too, that there is some switch of people who might vote Conservative, swing voters to every degree. You know, there's partisan people who are members of the party and they do whatever, but there's a lot of people who will vote. They might vote Conservative. They might have voted for Jean Chrétien, but they also might have voted for Brian Mulroney the decade before. So I feel like the NDP has kind of, also the other thing too is the collapse of the Greens. That's huge, especially like the Greens are going to lose in Fredericton, probably, it looks like. And it looks like they'll probably lose another seat too. I think it's Paul Manley. Yeah. So that's another thing too, that the Greens, before I think last election, they pulled at 6 point something federally. I think they're going to be well below that this election with their implosion. So I think it's a bunch of factors of the NDP taking some Green voters, taking some Conservative voters, taking a bunch of former Liberal voters too. How many people can I think of that voted for Trudeau in 2019 and are voting for Jagmeet Singh in 2021? On Jagmeet Singh's TikTok the other day, I saw a young woman who was probably like 20 say she grew up in a conservative family, but she's going to vote for Jagmeet Singh because he changed her mind from the TikTok videos. And she said that kind of got her out of the conservative boomer bubble that her parents brought her up in the comment. And I think that's another thing too, is that the NDP is just taken a little bit from every party. And it's kind of just really, the media actually did cover it to some degree. They actually did say, oh, Jagmeet Singh is the most popular leader in Canada. He's polling well with young people. Usually the NDP never gets that attention. So I feel like that when you also talk about what's happening, that also makes the trend escalate further in the media, because that's the thing too, is average people don't look at polls on Angus Reid. Average people don't look at polling information. So when they see a story though on Facebook or wherever that Jagmeet Singh is rising in the polls, they realize, oh, okay, the Conservatives aren't as much of a threat. Maybe I can vote NDP.
That's interesting, because I know like you're mentioning TikTok, and like I love your TikTok videos. I know you monitor not just TikTok but also Facebook, and like you're plugging with all this social media stuff. Are there any narratives to this upcoming election that you feel aren't being touched on by political parties, or things that are maybe opportunities that the broader left might want to take advantage of?
Like in terms of policy and stuff like that, and like
yeah, just in terms of like just the sentiment of the people. Like there's just like as an example, like I'm on Reddit all the time, and there's like definite frustration and anger that people feel like they can't get ahead. And even people who are like on the right are like, you know what, I'll put in the sweat, I'll put in the effort, I'll work my 70 hours a week. But now it's like I can't even make management putting in that blood and sweat. So I feel like that's a trend that people are feeling like no matter how hard they work, they aren't getting ahead like they used to. But I don't know if that's something that you see replicated in other social spaces, or.
I definitely see that replicated, and because it's so interesting, because I do a lot of like sociological research on conservative Facebook groups. I've been doing it for like years. I did it for school, and it's something that if Canada had a universal education, I would probably go on to study. But tying it right into that is there's so many of these groups that people, I've always found conservatives are much easier to radicalize, because they're in Canada, like statistically, they usually have a lot less money than Liberals. Liberals have the most wealthy support in Canada, which is different than the States where Democrat people tend to be lower income, and then it's usually Republicans or small business owners, people who make 90,000 a year or whatever. But I've definitely seen a sentiment across all social media of people struggling. People realize that if I go to McDonald's, it's costing me 15% more than it did 2 years ago. When I was in high school, you could get a $5 footlong sub. Now it's like $9. I've definitely seen a lot of conservatives talk about living expenses, groceries. Groceries is a huge one that I don't see. The conservatives frame it as inflation and it's related to the national debt, which isn't true. That's not why the price of stuff went up. The biggest reason why the price of stuff went up was product shortages and like problems in the supply chain. And still right now, COVID has still caused so many issues with shortages of truck drivers or shortages of products. And that caused things like graphics cards that are, you still can't get a graphics card, shortage in computer chips in cars and stuff like that. So I think, I think the Conservatives understand. Pierre Poilievre had that stupid ad where he's kicking down, he's trying to look all tough, whatever. Because I saw too the other day, the federal fundraising, the Conservatives raised the most money by a lot federally. And that's where that money goes, to a professional video editor who's going to edit. You know, Pierre Poilievre is walking and the gas prices are just astronomically going up. But that does work to some people, because people who drive cars will notice that gas prices went up. They notice that at the grocery store prices went up. Prices for everything went up. And he always links it to inflation because he's a dumbass. But I think that's a really huge area where people should be, where parties like the NDP, there's a lot of real estate there that they can really kind of push their side of that policy to talk about lowering costs of stuff like that, or talk about higher wages. So I feel like in terms of groups, there definitely is like a sentiment of suffering, struggling, whether it's people who have a neighbor who has long COVID, or someone who lost their job and now they're working as an Uber driver. There definitely is a sense of suffering there. But I find, especially with these topics, that people who are in these situations are very easily to radicalize. If they are, you know, an Uber driver now because they lost their previous job, or if they're working at a factory or something and they got laid off, it's really easy for them to blame that on immigrants, or blame that on the federal debt, or blame that on whatever, because they don't really know why it's happening, but they need someone to take their anger out because of their suffering. And unfortunately, that usually ends up being people like immigrants. When I worked in a factory, all the white people didn't like the immigrants because they thought the immigrants were taking the jobs, because the factory used to be mostly white people in the 80s. But the truth is, NAFTA made their jobs pay lower. Free trade made their jobs pay lower. They moved one of the plants to Mexico. That took away the jobs. It's not the people who came here as a refugee from Bangladesh and are working for minimum wage, like the people I work with. It's the people who are the politicians who decided, oh, we're going to do NAFTA, we're going to screw these workers over. So I really do feel like there's a lot of things that the NDP, the Greens, whoever, they can really take advantage of that to some degree, because in terms of my lifetime, like our lifetime, even older people's lifetime, COVID's created such a catastrophe that really hasn't been seen since World War II. There's been recession since. The recession in 2008 was bad, but this was much worse. This COVID recession had a much more direct impact on people. They always talk about the stock prices. Who cares about that? That's not how you measure a recession. You measure it in evictions, job losses, and we saw what the job losses, the historic job losses with COVID, that it's unprecedented since this fake country even started to exist. So I definitely think that there is a lot of real estate to work on that stuff, and to especially just listen to those people where they have problems with groceries expenses and gas expenses and all those kinds of things. I for sure think that's the way to go.
Mm-hmm. I always love talking to you because you're so well informed. It seems like you know everything. It's kind of maddening, because I wish I was in that same sphere. For other people who are like, yo, this guy's smart, I wish I knew more like he does. Like, where do you recommend people tune their attention to try to pick up on like some of this knowledge? And I'm asking in terms of like, again, like the official spaces you listen to, so like, or get your information from, and then like maybe be like the social side, like where do you get this like grassroots kind of feel for what's going on?
I think I'm not a very good member of my community, but I definitely think for people who, if you like the neighborhood you live in, that's a really good way to get the feel of what's going on. I do a lot of digital stuff, and especially with COVID, I do a lot more of like gauging where people feel about things from social media. But definitely in neighborhoods, especially if you live in a working class neighborhood, if you live or people you work with, I think that's a really good way to gauge how people feel and what's going on and what people think is going on, because there's always such a difference. There's always such a um, it, from what's happening to the way people interpret what people think is happening. There's always a big difference there, usually, I think. So I think that's why it's more important to pay attention of what people think is happening versus what's actually happening, because people's perception of what's happening is what's going to matter in terms of like how people vote, where the opinions, where the narratives and stuff are. So I feel like in getting terms of information, I feel like what you're doing here is a great way for people to just tune in, learn about stuff, and from a source that isn't Fox News or CBC or an information source of that, where it's actually from someone who's connected to the community at a grassroots level, compared to like Fox News or even CBC. It's a public broadcaster, but like their journalists make 90,000 a year or whatever, and they every week they're putting out an article about, oh, small businesses can't find employees and employers are struggling. And it's like, these people at CBC, their jobs are safe, they're making 90K a year. Why are they writing these articles? Why aren't they interviewing everyday people? So I feel like that's a part of it. And also to just being connected to people across the country, different parts of the world, to people with who might have similar views or just whatever, just knowing people in Quebec or BC, Alberta, Atlantic Canada, in the United States. That's a really good way to see what's going on, and like if they talk about their family, what their family thinks is happening and stuff.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think like for myself, I've always found it easier to talk to conservatives, especially because if you're just talking about where people are coming from in terms of what they think's happening. It's usually just a more enjoyable conversation because they're willing to engage with you. Typically, I know for like my experience with the Liberals is a lot of the time people aren't really concerned with what's happening, or even like talking to other people about why they think it's happening. They just I don't even know how to describe it. They just exist on a separate level. They just trust that everything is fine. You just kind of like and retweet whatever it is that Trudeau says. So I like that idea of just talking to people what they think's happening, because it also kind of takes you out of a zone where you might judge somebody or say actually, because you're just talking to people. I think that's such an important thing.
And I definitely think with Liberals, I find that socially, I guess I agree with them more on terms of stuff like LGBTQ stuff and like social justice in that sense. But fiscally, in terms of like living experiences, I often find way more if I'm talking to a conservative construction worker I work with, or whatever jobs I've had over the years. Those people, I connect with them much more at a fiscal level. Not that I'm a fiscal conservative, but they usually have more of a struggle to make money, or their family, things like that. The people who are in like the lower income class of conservatives, there's really isn't a lower income class of Liberals. There are always people who make more than 45,000. Like every single Liberal I see on Twitter, I can tell they're not on minimum wage. I can guarantee it. I can tell that they're making a decent wage. So, and they usually own their homes. So that's the thing. I definitely think, now obviously I'm not telling people to like talk to people who might be racist to them or prejudiced to them, but like still there's people who are just normal everyday people who, yeah, they probably vote for the Conservative Party, but that doesn't mean that they're super far right conservative. They vote for the Conservative Party because they think the Liberals are a bunch of elites, which is true. The Liberals are elites, but the Conservatives are too.
It's funny how it works. Like I feel like it really is representative of why the working class solidarity is so important, and like why just going into those conversations as just like a comrade, like be a comrade to all people. You don't have to be a comrade just to the left. And just going there to just ask what they think of what is going on, it really kind of makes it clear how, as working class people, our interests are so concretely aligned. And it just is kind of a good wholesome feeling, because a lot of the time when you get past like the QAnon and the other stuff that they've just kind of heard and regurgitate, it's just like you have the same perspective in a lot of ways. So that's cool. I guess like getting beyond like the education and moving towards like, so you kind of know what you're doing now in terms of like just the general person, and now you want to get involved. Like, what do you think is the best way to get involved with either making a difference in the election itself, or if maybe any of these issues are bothering you and you're like, I want to fix the problem, I don't care about politics?
I definitely think people always have the most interest in federal elections because that gets the most coverage across the country. There's the most ads usually. But the truth about the federal election is it's probably the least likely to impact you. My life hasn't, under Harper compared to Trudeau, there really wasn't any change in my life. So their policies are, you know what I mean? Like it is what it is. So I feel like for people, if you're interested in politics enough to be watching this video, if you're interested in politics enough to make a political Twitter account or even just pay attention to political news at all, I find it's much more worthy of your time to get more interested in provincial politics and municipal politics. And there's that whole electoral side where your municipal election is probably going to affect your day-to-day life the most. And things at the provincial level, we seem to forget, but things like roads, hospitals and healthcare, a lot of that stuff, daycare, that falls under provincial jurisdiction. And that's what liberals love to always say. That's always their line. It's jurisdiction, it's provincial jurisdiction. But what's under federal jurisdiction is usually less impactful on your everyday life. So usually in terms of voting participation, people vote the most in federal elections, then provincial, and then municipal has the lowest turnout, usually. But it should be the opposite technically, because those provincial elections and those municipal ones are going to impact your life way more, especially right now with COVID, because your provincial leaders are deciding what the COVID measures are going to be. So those are really important elections. Same at the municipal level too, though. The municipal level has a lot of power to lower COVID cases, even at the municipal level. So I think in terms of politics, there's kind of two sides you can get involved in. One is the electoral side, and that involves, you know, if you like a party, or even if you just like a specific candidate, not necessarily the party, you want to see that candidate get elected, you could volunteer for them, or you could get involved with the party, or even just promote. You know, Alex Jones talks about the info wars, but it is real, especially during COVID, that a lot of our political discourse is going to be online this election. It's especially with the shutdowns and stuff like that. So I feel like there's that side, but there's also the side of outside of the political sphere, the electoral political sphere. And I think that's the side that's usually more rewarding, because chances are, even if you really like a politician, you elect them, they say they're going to do something, they maybe do 30% of what they said they're going to do. And that's just the reality of our system, is even what's on the platform just doesn't get translated into legislation, even if that party gets elected. And that's the thing, is most people watching this are not going to like the conservatives or the liberals probably. And outside of that, it's really hard to get those people elected. So I think in terms of getting involved outside of electoral politics, things like mutual aid groups, things like social justice groups, things around that nature are much more rewarding, because they're going to have a more direct impact, especially like a mutual aid group, or things like around safe injection and stuff like that. Those types of groups, when you put labor, whether it's online or in person, into those groups, it's going to have a much more direct impact on bettering society than it is in electoral politics. Because for every 10 hours you phone bank for a political candidate, what is the return going to be for that, compared to if you have some spare time and you want to volunteer at a mutual aid group? That those 10 hours you put in are going to go directly to helping someone. Or it doesn't always have to be connected to a group. There's always things that people can do, whether it's just trying to get involved in your community, or helping a neighbor, especially during COVID, this kind of stuff, helping people if your neighbor needs groceries, or if you're in school and you want to help someone out, instead of people having to pay $20 an hour for a tutor, if you can help someone out with subjects and stuff like that. One thing I've done too is, over the years, I've given people advice about cars. So I'm not an expert, I'm not a mechanic, but I do know quite a bit about cars. I work on my own cars. So when it comes to cars, bikes, even stuff like landscaping, I'll give people advice, especially people who can't afford to hire a contractor and come to their house or whatever. If someone can just send me I've had where people send me a video of their car and say, this is a problem. And I'll say, okay, well, you have a dent. The shop quoted you $800 for a dent in your car. Just use a plunger and it's probably going to be fine. So I've had that stuff like that happen before. So I find like, because I think a lot of people, especially with COVID, I think a lot of people have, if they had social anxiety, that probably got way worse. And especially with places in Canada where there's just no restrictions anymore, I know some people are still kind of hesitant of getting involved in organizations and stuff like that. So I think there's always ways to help people to some degree. It doesn't always have to be through a group. You can still do mutual aid like work through an individual level. If you're not comfortable going into a group because of COVID or for whatever reason right now, you can still do a similar thing like that, whether it's helping a neighbor, helping a friend, or helping people like that in your community at, you could do it social distance or stuff like that.
That's awesome. And that's such a good point. Like, especially you like earlier talking about like the true measures of our economic kind of downfall at the present is looking at like people being evicted and things like that. And we know that those are going to start being instituted more and more as time goes by. And I think there's a story today about how a lot of districts are prioritizing their vaccines for cops, not because cops do good work, but because they need their cops to evict people. I think it's a good sign that maybe we're like prioritize working with tenant unions and things like that. Like for myself, I'm not like super excited to go out and like call people and do all these types of actions. But when I like volunteer with VTU, Vancouver Tenants Union, they made it such an easy process for me. And I never felt like I was like truly a part of a group, which for some people, if you want that interaction, I think they'll make it available to you. But I liked kind of having that agency of being my own person. And they just kind of hooked me up with the training and whatnot. And they gave me a list of people to call whenever you want to call them. And it was a really kind of a simple, liberating experience. So I highly recommend that for sure. And then just to kind of follow up on the other thing you said there, like I think like Alberta Advantage, Harbinger, they've got a lot of good podcasts, and that's where I get a lot of my information from. And I think they also echo what you're saying. Like if you want to see revolution, like start living that revolution. I think even Mexi, like a popular YouTuber, she says that too. Like we need to live the revolution. So just like being active in your community, even if it's like on Facebook and you see somebody asking a question, like if you know the answer, just help them out. And that will give you opportunities to A, grow, and then B, help build people seeing that socialists aren't bad people, and we want to help support people live their best life, I think. So that's pretty cool.
I should have said for my sources, I get all my information from Infowars.com.
Yeah, we need more of the impression. Yeah. Budrino Politics, absolutely beautiful podcast, amazing music, amazing impressions, and fantastic memes. I'm scarred by the presence of the Clintons behind you there, but other than that, you produce.
Yeah, they're pretty shocked. Yeah. Bill definitely represents how I think a lot of us feel in the past couple years.
Absolutely, yeah. I don't know if this is available, but we're doing this on August 3rd, and this is like the date that Nita Turner is having her election for Ohio, and she's a super radical candidate, rad candidate. Do you know how she's doing right now? Have you taken a look at polls?
I think polls closed at 7:30, so I haven't. I know it's going to be close, I think, because they dumped so much dark money into it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the Clintons fought hard to keep her out. It's been absolutely disgusting.
Yeah, they like, that's not like a conspiracy theory the way centrists will portray it to be. They actually did. Like they tried very hard to stop. And for so long she was ahead in the polls, but they tried really, really hard to stop her.
Yeah. No, if she gets that platform, I think things will start moving. But I don't know. We'll see. I think we've taken a lot of your time. I don't know if there's a thought that you wanted to wrap on or anything that you're thinking of lately.
I just think in terms of the election, I think what's coming up now is definitely pretty important. And I think from every indicator I have from people I know inside the Liberal Party, from people I know in other parties, it's going to happen. The only thing that could possibly stop this election from happening at this point is going to be something to do with COVID, some kind of like massive surge in the next week or something. But from what I understand, they're probably going to call it within a week. So it's most likely going to happen, barring some unusual kind of circumstance. And I think, I definitely think it's pretty important to, as much as I don't think federal politics is that important in your day-to-day life, I definitely think that keeping Trudeau to a minority is much better than letting him get a majority. So in terms of, I know a lot of people probably aren't going to volunteer and do stuff for political candidates because, like I said, even I don't do a lot of stuff like that. You just don't get the return necessarily you would doing other stuff, but still definitely at least vote. At the minimum, vote. I know some people don't want to vote for certain, they don't want to participate in Canada's electoral system for certain reasons, but I do think it's very important to vote, mostly just because if Trudeau gets a majority, there will be it will affect people. He'll start putting people in jail for improperly claiming CERB like he tried to. There will be austerity at some point because this deficit is so high. There will eventually be a austerity probably later into his term that probably will affect people in Canada. So I do think it's important to vote. It's not going to solve all your problems, and I definitely think it's important to notice that. But I do think at the bare minimum, even if you vote for the Communist Party, or even if you vote for whatever, I do think showing some form of participation is useful, just in the sense that sometimes, especially with COVID, we don't know what the turnout's going to be. So turnout might be super low in some ridings, and then your vote is going to be way more impactful than it would normally be. Or it could be the same thing as the States, where in the last election there was a historic participation. Like Trump won more votes than he did before, and there's a rise in participation. And then that also means that a rise in participation probably means it's more likely the Liberals will get a majority. So I do think it's important to, as we're on the cusp of this election, I do think it's important to vote, at least just for, it doesn't matter if it's the Communist Party, whatever party, just vote to some degree. I think everyone who is not a Liberal has something in common this election, and that's keeping Trudeau to a minority. And that's something a lot of people don't want to admit, because they don't want to say I have something in common with the Conservative. But that is something that Conservatives, the Bloc, the NDP, the Greens, everyone wants to keep the Liberals to a minority. So I do think it's important for people to realize that that's the ultimate goal of this election. I think I think it's possible to keep Trudeau to a minority for sure, if the right factors happen.
Well, that's the most inspiring thing I've heard this year. So thank you so much for your time, sir. Again, this is Budrino from Budrino Politics. I absolutely recommend that you watch him throughout this upcoming election. Try to stay informed and have some fun at the same time, because it's going to be a barn burner. Yeah, Budrino, thank you so much for your time, sir.
Thanks for having me on. I really enjoyed the show.
Sweet. Thank you, sir.
Peace.